So, this is going to be a bit of a long one, but it's biblical gender roles. The last time I covered Larry, he was trying to argue that he should be allowed to beat his wife, which certainly laid the groundwork for a couple of fan theories of why he lost his last wife. He made a part 2, and 3, and 4, and 5 to his myriad of reasons why he should be allowed to beat his wife. He's a classic example of the adage, when did you stop beating your wife? And his answer will be, when the Bible stopped being true. And because he believes that the Bible is true, no, he'd never stop beating his wife. Allegedly. So, let's go ahead and take a look at his 19th century suffragette view on domestic discipline. Another one of his little bits of wife-beating apologia. 5-part series, yes. He's got the biblical case for domestic discipline, a 19th century suffragette view on domestic discipline, 17th century judicial precedents regarding domestic discipline, experience with incorporating domestic discipline, a newlywed's wife experience with incorporating domestic discipline. He has... This is what I imagine happens in Larry's household, in BGR's household. Honey, welcome home. I made your favorite food. Thanks, hun. Did you put the salt in it? I figured I'd let you salt it yourself. Well, honey, you know what the Bible says what I'm supposed to do in this situation, right? And then, I'm not going to enact anything past that point because I have not given an adequate trigger warning. But your imagination can fill in the blank. And it's really sad, because I want to say that I'm making up a fiction. But based on the things in this blog, it's very hard for me to make the case that this is actually a fiction. This is a thing that he does try to do. So let's go ahead and read his blog. Let's see what he has to say. In this second article in our series on domestic discipline, we will be looking at the 19th century suffragette views on domestic discipline. To do this, we will look at 2 primary sources. The first is the Declaration sentiments, which were issued from the First Women's Rights Conference in 1848 in New York. The second source we'll be looking at is the History of Women's Suffrage from 1848 to 1861. Now, please remember, Larry is the kind of guy who believes that women should not be allowed to vote. He believes that women are subservient to men. He believes that men should be allowed to beat their wives. So he's likely going to be looking at these things and giving us quite the interesting view on them. I don't know if I think interesting was the right word for that. In fact, actually, that was the very wrong word for that. For that, I'm going to take a hammer to the face. This would be the first time I've actually used this hammer to bludgeon myself and to try to maintain my sanity by rattling around my one brain cell I've got left. But this will be an interesting time to see if this one hits about as hard as the old one. Not as solid of a hit as I would have expected. Then again, my brain has probably gotten a lot more resilient to bullshit since I've been covering a lot more BGR. Now that the new hammer has been christened properly, let us continue. The Declaration of Sentiments was America declaring its independence from England. Wait, why the fuck does this matter? Below is the portion issued from the Declaration of Sentiments from the First Women's Rights Conference in 1848. Okay. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man towards women, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And he's omitted part of this. He has made her, morally, an irresponsible being, as she can commit many crimes with impunity, provided they be done in the presence of her husband. In the covenant of marriage, she is compelled to promise obedience to her husband, he becoming to all intents and purposes her master, the law giving him power to deprive her of her liberty and to administer chastisement. Not untrue for that time. Not untrue. So, we're going to have to read this in Larry's actual voice. And for anybody who's in the comment section who goes, you can't be taken seriously whenever you use your voice. You can't be taken seriously when you use voices for people. This dude beats his wife. I'm going to make fun of him however I fucking well please. Please, thank you, and fuck off. As Bible-believing Christians, we can and should recognize the 1848 Declaration of Sentiments for what it is, and still is today, a declaration of war on God's institution of patriarchy. You know how people argue that the feminists were wrong because we don't live in a patriarchal society, we live in an egalitarian one? Here's your argument against that. The sad truth is that more than 170 years later, that war has been mostly won by feminists. Ah, yes, I can no longer beat the shit out of my wife and them god-darn feminists. Them gosh-darn feminists. I wanted to break her nose today, but gosh darn it. The feminists won. Now I can only write bigoted blog posts about how much I want to beat the fuck out of my wife. Man, those darn feminists. Those who still hold to God's design of patriarchy would have been forced into hiding, with their only option to fight a spiritual guerrilla warfare against those who seek to eradicate the last pockets of resistance to the reigning humanist regimes. Oh boy! My voice gives me super strength. My hair gives me the power to defy gravity. Okay, so, my thing here with this, right? He thinks that people who want to beat their wives are engaged in guerrilla warfare. They're fighting a regime against the regime of the feminists and the humanists. They called themselves feminists, but don't you know a woman's place is in the kitchen? They call themselves humanists, but humans are supposed to be under God. Don't you understand? Don't you see? It's like Antifa. They're the real fascists. That's basically what I'm getting from BGR here. This whole shit about LARPing, that he's engaged in some guerrilla warfare shit. I have to beat my wife in the basement now thanks to these feminists. I used to be able to do it right next to the local Walmart. That's what he's upset about. That's where he's upset. He doesn't get to hit his wife as much as he wanted to. That's where we are. And no wonder his first wife left him. There is no wonder. There is no wonder in my mind why this man lost his first wife. And I have a feeling, based on what I read in these articles, that his current wife doesn't want to be beat, and as a result, he's writing all these articles so he can go, now, honey, I understand that you do not want me to beat the ever-loving shit out of you. I understand that you prefer your arm to be unbroken. I understand that you need that pinky toe and you do not want me to crush it with a cane, but by golly, the good Lord has given me the power. The good Lord has invested into me His honesty, His trust, His need for me to teach you a lesson. You were not being a good wife. You did not salt my steak properly. And as you know, if you do not give me exactly the right amount of salt on my steak, I have to teach you a lesson. Now, honey, I don't want to do this, but Christ is to be to his church as I am to be to my wife. And what does Christ do to his followers who do not love him and treat him properly? That's right, they burn in hell. So you know what you're going to do? You're going to go into that kitchen, you're going to turn that oven on, and you're going to put your hands right inside it, honey. Not all Christians are like this. I think it goes without saying, not all Christians are like this. In fact, most Christians are not like this. But then you've got people like BGR who argue that because of this book, they should be allowed to physically assault people, should be allowed to hurt people, should be allowed to torture them. Fuck this book. If you're going to use it in that capacity. Full stop. But we continue. In the covenant of marriage, she is compelled to promise obedience to her husband. The common law of the land, in this case, we have strongly aligned with the word of God, is that they may teach young women to be sober, to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, keepers of the home, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God be not blasphemed. In fact, we can rightly say that the Declaration of Sentiments' complaint against women being compelled by common law to be obedient to their husbands was in fact blasphemy against the word of God. My God. My dude. You're like fucking... This is like the incel manifesto. I'm such a nice guy. I only wanted to break her jaw. Like, when I read shit like this, when I hear shit like this, when I hear people try to make these arguments, I just want to slam my head into this wall right here, which I understand would be a bad thing, because we're only 8% of the way towards saving up enough to fix the house. And given that we're only 8% of the way to saving up enough to fix the house, I wouldn't want to add more repairs to the house, but holy shit, it would be cathartic. Every time I read a BGR article, to be able to just slam my head into something and forget. And just completely forget that I did that. The husband, to all intents and purposes, is her master. Again, the scriptures are crystal clear on this point, calling women to regard their husbands as their earthly lords or their masters. For after this manner in the old time the holy women also, who trusted in God, adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters ye are, as long as ye do well, and are not afraid with any amazement. The Greek word used in Peter 1:6 is kurios. That's very curious. Which means master. It is used in reference to kings, governors, slave masters, husbands, and to God himself in the Bible. All of these masters were authorities instituted by God over different spheres, but God is the Lord and master of all. The Hebrew equivalent of the Greek kurios is Baal, which means owner, lord, master. I'm the master of my wife. I baited her into it. I groomed her. You might even say I masturbated over her. Sorry, I had to do it. I had to make the joke. I had to cut this with something. Yeah, he's definitely for slavery. In Deuteronomy 22:22, we see the following example showing the husband's ownership over his wife. If a man may be found lying with a woman married, Baal used as the verb, to a husband, then both of them shall die. Both the man that lay with the woman and the woman, thou shalt put away evil from Israel. The passage above demonstrates that under God's law, a married woman is owned, and her owner is her husband. So you know when people like Matt Dillahunty are arguing this, and they point out that old school biblical laws regarding women treated them like property, and we get the galaxy brain take, no they weren't. Yes, the fuck they were. Women were treated like property back then, and people like BGR want to go back to a time where women are like property. That is exactly what BGR wants. He wants women to be property. If he had a MAGA hat, It would say make women property again. But mwapa doesn't ring off the tongue. The husband's power to administer chastisement. The power to chastise is critical as an element of authority. If a person can tell others what to do, but they have no means of enforcing what they have commanded, then they really are not an authority. Correct. This is one of the first correct things you said. But BGR, there's nothing that says that you should be an authority over your wife. Like, there's nothing that says that you should be an authority over your wife, except for the one book that's way over here. You know, I mean, there's this. You can say that this says I'm an authority over your wife. That's what this says, that a man is an authority over their wife. But if I were to use that logic, because I see the Bible as any other book to me, then I'm just going to go grab a random book off of my shelf. A random book, right? Anyone. And I'm just going to use that as my authority and say, no, according to this book, I don't have to. Oh, your book is more important because it was written several hundred years earlier? I don't care. Arguments from antiquity don't do anything for me. And people that try to say, oh, well, it's because my God is definitely real. Well, if you serve a God that wants you to beat your wife, then I'd rather believe in that God and hate it and try to kill it than I would like to actually engage in the level of dumbfuckery you're functioning under. I don't want to. I don't want to deal with it. So, what else do we have in this lovely clusterfuck of an article that is arguing that he really, 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 really wants to beat his wife? Which also, by the way, just by the way, can we accept the logical consequence of this? Right? Let's engage in the principle of entailment real quick. Which, if you look it up, you're not going to find principle of entailment. That's the nomenclature that I've been using for years. It's actually called logical consequences. Argument from logical consequence. And if we look at the argument from logical consequence, we will find that if you agree that any husband should be allowed to beat their wife, then let's say that this Tabasco bottle is a father. This allergy bottle, this is the daughter. And then the daughter grows up. She's now a little hot sauce bottle like this. Not quite the same as dad, but you know, doesn't have to be. This thermos. This is her would-be husband. They get married. The father, if this father is BGR, has accepted that it is okay for his daughter, once married, to be beat. That's effectively what you're arguing for. You're not just arguing that you should have power over your wife. You are, per logical consequence, per entailment, you are arguing that your daughter should be allowed to be beat. If the husband wants to beat the fuck out of your daughter, well, by golly, he's gonna do it. Because the husband has power to administer chastisement. Fuck you. My only thing I can say to that is fuck you. If you truly believe that that is a just world, that not only should you be allowed to beat your wife, but your daughter, your child, should be allowed to be mercilessly taken down. Just because she is dating someone who has a fucking penis. What kind of functional world do you create? You create a material reality where half the population can just be beat. For merely the sin of being born. And to justify it, you'd have to prove that your God exists. And then also that everything he said in the Bible was true. And then also that those things being true mean that we have to logically follow them. You've got a lot of shit to prove before we have to accept that it's okay to beat our partners. The woman who wrote History of Women's Suffrage lived in an era where wife spanking was still widely practiced and culturally accepted. So their perspective is valuable in the historical sense, even with their moral position on the rights of women and husbands chastising their wives being unbiblical and wrong. In those early days, the husband supremacy was often enforced in the rural districts by corporeal punishment, and it was considered by most people as quite right and proper. As much so as the correction of refractory children in the like manner, the laws made it his privilege, and the Bible, as interpreted, made it his duty. If you go to the average Christian today, in the average Christian church, even most conservative evangelical churches, and start talking about domestic discipline, they have no clue what you're talking about. I know if you would have mentioned it to me 7 or 8 years ago, I would have been one of the people with a blank look. Oh, the lore gets deeper. The lore gets deeper. When did BGR and his wife divorce? Because it might be that BGR found all this bigoted shit and started agreeing that because he was born with a fucking penis, that suddenly meant that it was okay for him to do all these things, and his wife just went, that's okay, Larry. Fuck you. You're not beating me with that rod. No, Larry. No. I don't care that you've only got a 2-inch dick, Larry. That doesn't matter. That doesn't give you justifiable reason to beat me. Alright, you keep coming at me with that rod, we're a fucking frying pan right in your face. That's what we get there. The lore is now that BGR's wife left him because he wanted to beat her. That's where we're at. That's what I'm reading into this. Why does his wife sound like Ben Shapiro? Because she's a very successful doctor wife. She's a very successful doctor wife. Larry, I'm here to tell you. I'm just here to tell you that if you don't know, it is perfectly natural. It is perfectly natural for women to be dry the entire time, Larry. It is perfectly natural for you to not make me come, Larry. No, I'm not leaving you because you can't satisfy me. I'm leaving you because you're trying to assault me. Say hypothetically, Larry, hypothetically, for the sake of argument, you wanted to beat me. Then, hypothetically, for the sake of argument, I would be leaving your ass out on the street. I am happy to have been challenged on this subject because it caused me to really have to research this out. I already showed in my first article in this series that the Bible fully supports 2 important concepts. First, it supports the concept of corporal punishment for both children and adults. Because Larry wants to beat his kids as much as he wants to beat his wife. God chastening his wife in Israel in the Old Testament, and Christ chastening his wife, the church, in the New Testament. But then we come to the historical side of this. Before the 20th century, most Christians believed that, according to the Bible, husbands had a right and duty to chasten their wives using corporal punishment. The common laws of the land supported this right. And except for left-wing feminists in the 19th century, Christian women fully accepted this too. This is because when you grow up in a society that accepts certain things, bigoted or otherwise, you tend to accept them going forward in life as well because they're just the norm. They're just the thing that you grew up with. Doesn't make it right. Like take capitalism as an example. How many people have made the argument to you, if you're an anti-capitalist, that, well, capitalism's how things have always been. This is just how things have always been. Why would they change? Why should they change? Ignoring the fact that feudalism was a thing, before modern day capitalism, before fucking Edmund Burke sat there and went, if the monarchy goes down, I've got to maintain my position of power somehow. How could I possibly do that? I know. Ignore the divine right of kings and go to the divine right of the market. That's... When you hear that shit, it is just an argument from antiquity. Things operated for a while like this, so things should continue to operate like that going forward, because that's just what we do. And that's just what we've been doing. It's okay Is what we've been doing. It's like people with spanking. They think spanking their kids is okay because they were spanked as a kid. And then you get into the actual research on spanking and find that actually, no, this isn't the most effective punishment method. There's actually better punishment methods that are more creative, have more longer lasting effects, and cause children to actually respect you as opposed to just be afraid of you. But they ignore all that because, well, they weren't fucked up that bad when it happened to them. Well, you know what they say. If you are a child and the parent uses the rod on you, you will not die. That's what's said in the Bible in one of the BGR passages. The last time we covered this. Do you want to be immortal, Billy? If you guys remember that one. So, let's continue with BGR. See what else he's got to say on this. On page 599 of the History of Women's Suffrage, because I enjoy cherry-picking, by the common law of England, the spirit of which has been faithfully incorporated into our statute law, a husband has a right to whip his wife with a rod not larger than his thumb. That's larger around? Like, the rod has to be this big around. It's not you can beat her with a rod that's this long. It's that big around. But the rod can be really big. It can basically whip. That's fine. To shut her up in a room and administer whatever moderate chastisement he may deem necessary to ensure obedience to his wishes. You know, wishes kind of like rape. You want to have sex with your partner? Your partner does not want to have sex? Wham bam. Now they have to. Spare the rod. Spoil the BDSM. And her healthful moral development. It's moral for her to be forced to fuck you. He can forbid all persons harboring or trusting her on his account. He can deprive her of all social intercourse with her nearest and dearest friends. He is literally allowed to isolate you. That is what that says. Husbands were allowed to literally isolate their partners from everyone. So they could not seek help. They could not seek help. Brendan Murphy, I know he doesn't think marital rape is a thing because I've gone into his arguments about marital rape. I have a video on that too. He doesn't think it's rape because the wife consents to all sexual intercourse as soon as she signs the marriage slip. That's what he fucking believes. That's what Steven Anderson believes as well. If by great economy she accumulates a small scum, which her future needs she deposit little by little in a savings bank, her husband has a right to draw it out at his option and use it as he may see fit. Look at that. Not only is he allowed to isolate you, not only is he allowed to beat you, not only is he allowed to force you to fuck, he's also allowed, if you get any amount of money with which to try to earn an emancipation for yourself, to buy your own land, to get the fuck away from this abusive monster, he is allowed by law to steal all of that money, take it from you, and use it for whatever he wants, probably alcohol, so that he can continue to convince himself that it's okay that he's beating the ever-loving fuck out of you every day. That is really, really messed up. A husband chastening his wife was seen as healthy and moral in her marriage. Yeah, slavery was also seen as right back in the day. Who the fuck cares? By his powers of chastisement, they were not limited to just corporal punishment. He could also ground his wife as a parent grounds their child and sends them to the room. This was normally accepted practice under common law. Again, who the fuck cares? This is... Shallow is correct. This is big fucking incel energy. This is huge incel energy. How much more do we have? Oh boy. Just a section and a conclusion, and then the suffering is over. On page 792 of History of Women's Suffering, it states, Wife-beating is still so common even in America that a number of states have of late introduced bills directed to the punishment of the wife-beater. Great surprise is frequently shown by these men when arrested. "If she's not my wife... Is she not my wife?" is cried in tones, proving the brutal husband has been trained to consider the relationship a sufficient justification for any abuse. Yeah, that's I don't have anything to say about that. Chastisement did not have enough of a sting to it. In fact, in the late 19th century, the word chastisement in America was seen as a positive word. So then feminists went... The feminists! They went from speaking about husbands chastising to wives to calling them wife-beaters. That's because that's what it was. That's because that's what it was, Larry. Because they were wife-beaters. Because they were beating their wives. That's what a wife-beater is, Larry. That's what a wife-beater is. Somebody who beats their wife is a wife-beater. I don't see how I have to justify that anymore. Like, the thing, you're so upset that the thing they were doing is the thing they were called? Blasphemy. Absolute blasphemy. Yes, he advocates for this 18th century law. It's in a 5-part series of why he should be allowed to beat the snot out of his partner. They declared that a husband chastising his wife in any form was abuse. Now, to be sure, there were some men who took their right to chastise their wives too far, causing serious or permanent injuries to their wives. And this, of course, was the case throughout the history of mankind. It was no means unique to America. But the exact same thing could be said for parents, whether they were fathers or mothers, who chastised their children, that some abused their authority to administer corporal chastisement. But the fact that some husbands abused their power did not give civil governments the right to remove this God-given power from husbands. What they should have done was deal with those extreme cases on a case-by-case basis. What? Police, open up. Just so you know, look. He used a rod to beat you, but it was not big enough. It was not bigger than his thumb. So this was perfectly acceptable. We have shown that the early feminists declared war on biblical patriarchy from the very beginning of their movement in 1848. They utterly rejected God's design of male headship over women. These early feminists, or suffragettes, knew they had to play on the emotions of American people to win their cause. And they did exactly that. They found the most extreme and outlandish cases of abuse they could find to bring before the courts and state legislators to prove that all men were potential abusers or wife-beaters. My dude, if you beat your wife in any capacity without her consent, you're a wife-beater. That's how that works. Get the fuck over it. The only way to protect the women from the abuses of men was to completely strip men of their power of corporal chastisement over their wives. Yes, the way to stop men from having the power to beat women is to strip them of the power to beat women. Yes, that's how that works, you dipshit. That's how that works, you absolute single brain-celled, smooth-brained piece of cocksucked garbage. But we also learned something else in this article, something that husbands and wives today need to see. The idea that if a husband is using corporal punishment to chastise his wife, it is not some recently invented behavior by some far-right Christians. Nobody argues it's a recently invented behavior. They argue that it's an archaic and outdated practice. You absolute moron. You absolute dipshit. It is not just some kinky BDSM thing. Actually, it is, in the way in which it's healthy. But rather, before late 19th century, it was protected law of the land, and Christians believed husbands had the biblical right and duty to exercise corporal chastisement on their wives for their good moral development and the health of their marriages. My dude, Larry, I understand that you can't make your wife come. That does not mean you have to beat her for not satisfying you. I understand that you're upset that your first wife left you. The answer is not to beat the second one. Trust me. I understand that your brain is stuck in the 19th century because somebody said that this was a good thing to do, and you agreed, you believed it because you're an immoral piece of garbage. But none of that really matters. The world has moved on ahead from pieces of shit like you. And yeah, I'm sure there's somebody in the comment section who's going to go on and just go, why are you being so mean to him? He beats his wife. How more mean do I, like, how many people does he have to hurt for me to be okay to be mean to him? How many people does he have to convince that it's okay for them to beat their wives? Like, here's him defending his position. I disagree that corporal punishment should be a last resort. Rather, it should be a normal and regular part of marriage from biblical gender roles. He literally argues that this should be just an accepted thing that people do on a daily basis. I'm going to be mean to him. I'm going to. I don't see anything wrong with that. But what do you think? Like, obviously this is the part where we throw the conversation at you. What do you think of biblical gender roles? What do you think about his views on women? If he even views them as human or not, that's a different question. Interesting one. But yeah, no. He's definitely an idiot. He's definitely dumb, and he's definitely abusive. That's where I sit. I think I've made my position on him abundantly clear. But, let me know what you think.